Welcome to John Wick Hex, one of only 2 officially licensed John Wick games to date, and the worst game to ever feature his likeness. Yes, this is including Fortnite. John Wick Hex is a strategy game where players are required to navigate John through linear levels while taking out the huge amount of enemies sent your way. The game plays very much like a turn-based strategy game, but instead of set turns, every action costs a certain amount of time, which allows enemies to move and react to your decisions. Whenever a new enemy is discovered, the game will pause and allow the player to carefully choose the next action for John to perform. This kind of decision making is helped by the timeline preview on the top of the screen, which allows the player to know how long it will take to perform a certain action and whether it is likely to be interrupted by an incoming attack. I was personally a fan of this kind of combat system, although, like so much in this game, I just wish it had been expanded upon further and been given more depth. The close quarters combat, for example, remained the same from the very first mission to the very last encounter. And although it makes sense that such a skilled hitman like John wouldn't be drastically improved in combat over the course of presumably only around a week of the storyline, it did wear somewhat thin by the end of the roughly 7-hour campaign. Frankly, I don't think anyone on the face of the earth would really give 2 fucks if John was given new abilities just because the plot didn't properly accommodate it. The only real progression in the game was arguably the weapons, with a larger variety of guns being trickled throughout the campaign. The only problem is that the starting weapon, a simple 9mm pistol, was so adaptable that it was often my go-to gun throughout most of the game. Revolvers, for example, were much more powerful, however, their tendency to take much longer to fire in a game where the most important resource is time was often detrimental in situations with more than 1 or 2 enemies. This was a running theme with most weapons, and although I loved using assault rifles or shotguns for their reliable kills, committing to multiple shots was more times than not an easy way to get myself respawned. My favorite weapon was the carbine, and although it only appeared a handful of times, it was a delight every time I was able to pull the trigger. The lack of progression is perhaps the biggest criticism of John Wick Hex. I hate having skill trees just for the sake of progression, but for a game that can be completed in only a handful of sessions, I feel that it could have really improved the incentive to continue and given the game far more replay value with specific builds and playstyles. I've never designed the game, so I won't pretend to understand the complexity of implementing a system like this, but even just flat increases to the damage or to the speed of actions would have been welcome. No criticism would have come from borrowing the better bits from similar titles if this meant the combat could evolve at all at any point of the game. Each mission is broken up into multiple levels, and players are given a limited amount of currency to spend on either weapon or bandage stashes or temporary perks. The perks themselves never seemed to be worth the admittedly high cost when they didn't carry over to each mission, so by the end of the game, almost every coin I had was invested into bandages and weapon stashes. The main reason is because John only has a limited amount of bandages per mission, meaning that failing to save them for later levels will either force the player to clutch out a stage taking no damage or restart the entire mission with more careful resource management. The guns themselves also carry over from the last level, meaning that if you're a dumb shit like me, who left a previous stage with a nearly empty weapon, you'll have to make do until you can kill an enemy for theirs. Ammunition in John Wick Hex isn't rare, but players can only carry a single weapon at a time and can only equip a spare magazine through weapon caches. What this means in practice is that in my entire playthrough, I ended up reloading around 10 times, but throwing empty guns at enemies around 100 times. The art style and music are perfectly fine. They are not winning any awards, but they also won't detract from your enjoyment. The camera could also use some work, as it often felt strangely rigid, even when it can be controlled. The story was also very mediocre, but did however attract an excellent cast of Ian McShane, Lance Reddick, and Troy Baker, who you might recognize from every video game ever made. Presumably, Keanu Reeves didn't have time to voice the game, as John himself doesn't utter a single word at any point during the game. The Swag News team have all been contracted until the end of the year, so after telling them to do some fucking work, their research determined that he was busy saving puppies from burning buildings and working on objectively better games. As much as this channel probably doesn't reflect it, I fucking love strategy games. I've played around 300 hours of XCOM 1 and 2, and this year alone, I've bought 3 copies of Age of Empires 3 to play with friends. A feature that I've always wanted to see, in turn-based games especially, was a replay system that allows the entire level to be played out in real time and show how a level that took 30 minutes to complete would only be around 2 or 3 minutes in a real-time simultaneous playback. John Wick Hex actually has this feature, but due to the robotic and even primitive animations, the playback of each level isn't nearly as spectacular as I had hoped, especially when it's just a long drawn out sequence abusing the AI. What you're currently watching is probably the most cinematic sequence I was able to capture throughout the game. Viewers can draw their own conclusions from what they're currently witnessing. The camera in these sequences was also very choppy and unappealing at times, which is such a shame when the John Wick movie franchise is famous for its emphasis on expertly choreographed stunts and cinematography and not needing to rely on the crutch of having 9 jump cuts during ugly action sequences. The biggest problem gameplay wise may have once again been influenced by people who aren't game designers. Supposedly John Wick Hex was originally entirely turn-based, but after showing early gameplay to Lionsgate executives, they were concerned that this wouldn't make John look very cool if he just stood there and took bullets. And although I can partially agree, this super hot inspired game decision ran into the same problems as the game it likely took inspiration from. If we are on the subject, it would be fucking great to see a John Wick in a super hot inspired game into the future, as what we are getting here is, for better or worse, a puzzle game disguised as something more interesting. When thinking about taking on the role of John Wick, I'd like to be able to rampage through waves of people with style and efficiency. However, the way the AI is designed makes the most effective strategy to be the complete opposite. Most of the time, passing difficult levels was simply a case of funneling enemies through choke points and taking them on one by one, or retreating to early parts of the map before picking off stragglers. Cover is also seriously easy to abuse, as breaking line of sight with an enemy will often cancel their action and allow you to retaliate without being damaged. The enemies themselves were fine, although the archetypes never seemed very distinct in many ways, and they all seemed to dress as if they were either working in lower management or waiting tables at a wedding reception. There are certainly harder enemies near the end of the game, but these were mostly due to having higher health or better weapons, as opposed to behaving any differently. The bosses themselves were a fucking joke, as once a player figures out that you simply have to punch them a few times before loading them with bullets, they quickly become the most trivial and basic boss fights you're likely to encounter. The hardest levels were the ones with an overwhelming amount of enemies at once, and in particular, set in places that catered to the deadly sightlines of those armed with weapons. Much of the time was just spent breaking sightlines and sneaking in a hit whenever possible, as firing off a shot would leave John far too exposed to be one shot by one of the numerous bad guys in the area. By the end of the game, these kinds of fights really showed off the worst aspects that John Wick Hex had to offer and really kept me longing for anything new or upgraded that I could have used as a late game treat. Some levels took over 40 to 50 minutes to pass, simply because I wasn't properly abusing the game systems. Civilization game designer Soren Johnson once said, "Given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of a game," and when talking about the last few levels of John Wick Hex, I couldn't have agreed more. The entire game is currently exclusive to PC, but the studio has expressed their interest in other platforms. I personally only play a handful of mobile games, but if I saw this for $5 in the Play Store, I'd certainly consider it a well worth purchase. But for even $20 as it currently stands, I find it so hard to recommend, especially when you can pick up super hard to feel like John Wick, or XCOM 2, which will last 20 times longer, is 100 times deeper, and has an insane amount of progression from the very start. Perhaps I was just a victim of my own expectations. Players shouldn't play Rainbow Six Siege expecting to run into a situation guns blazing, or play Subnautica thinking you won't struggle for the first few hours, or any Dark Souls game expecting to have fun. I went into a game called John Wick Hex with the assumption that it would make me feel like John Wick, and I was left feeling disappointed with the puzzle game it was accurately marketed to be. And that sentence, at the end of the day, cannot better summarize my thoughts on John Wick Hex.
Don't be so quick to walk away. Dance with me, I wanna rock your body.